Great to see you and speak with you guys again. I am gonna share my screen, and I was telling Greg, I want to warn you guys. I tried something a little bit technologically ambitious, and hopefully Zoom and the internet will cooperate. So let's go to presenter mode. Moment. And okay, great. I'm pretty excited to talk to you guys today about this topic, the Aleppo Codex, the other book in the shrine. Now, the thing is, I was really sitting down. For those of you who were at my last class, you may remember that I talked about a rabbi and a banker and some farmers, and I said, that was, that's a pretty sexy topic, but I think I need to go even sexier to get people to come. So instead, I'm going to talk about a book. But honestly, this book is something that piqued my interest naturally. I actually didn't know too much about it the first time I encountered it. But as time went on, the more I heard it come up, casual conversations or things that I was reading, and I eventually decided that I needed to take a deep dive into what exactly this book was and what I was looking at. And in order to do that, I kind of entered a world that I didn't really know existed. And at the very end of this, I also want to tell you guys why I think, in my own opinion, in addition to all the other reasons that may be obvious, why I think this book is so important to us even today. Before that, we need to kind of understand, obviously, the background. So if you've spent any kind of time in Jerusalem, touring at all, odds are you spent some time at the Israel Museum. The Israel Museum is an amazing, it's like Israel's national museum. It has art, it has history, it has sculpture garden, it has the wine festival, many people probably know from that. But the crown jewel of the Israel Museum is the section known as the Shrine of the Book, right? And it's pretty distinct, you can't miss it. It's probably what you picture if you're picturing the Israel Museum. It's that image on the left. It's what my students always refer to as, hey, what's in that giant Hershey kiss? That's the Shrine of the Book. And as cool as it looks on the outside, it's actually even more amazing on the inside, because what it is it actually holds the very famous Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, scrolls found, written copies of the Torah, probably now, it's hard to keep track with all the discoveries, but now I believe it's considered the second oldest copy of the Torah that we have, found in the caves of Qumran, just in the northern Dead Sea. And they are, super important and, some of our oldest copies and tie us to our past. And there's even this crazy rumor, I've never heard this confirmed anywhere, and I don't even know if it's true, but the fact that this rumor exists says something about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The rumor is that there's a button on the Prime Minister's desk that if there's a nuclear war, he just presses the button and the Dead Sea Scrolls will submerge into an anti-nuke bunker. So whether or not that's true, the fact that there's a rumor about it says how important the Dead Sea Scrolls are. And that is basically what you have here in the Shrine of the Book. On these side walls over here, you have different pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in the middle you have the centerpiece, which is the Isaiah scroll. It's a complete scroll of the book of Isaiah. This is actually a replica. I don't mean to burst the bubble there, but this is actually a replica. Here's a closer look at all this. You come in, you walk up the stairs. Before you even walk into this room, though, there's like all these other display cases of things found in the same caves in Qumran dating back to the time of the Second Temple. And that's the Shrine of the Book, you would think. And if that's all that was in the Shrine of the Book, that would make a lot of sense. However, it's not the only thing that's in the Shrine of the Book. If you actually notice, just down here, you see this little yellow window down below the Isaiah scroll. That is something else beneath the Isaiah scroll. There's actually two staircases, one on each side, that will take you downstairs, and there's another exhibit. Now, when I was training to be a teacher at Alexander Muss, I went in with the teacher who was training me and with his class, and he did a spiel outside about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he took them inside, and then I noticed that there was a downstairs, and I was kind of waiting for him to, call the group back together and say, okay, guys, this is what's downstairs, now let's go downstairs and talk about it. And it never came. And I was waiting and waiting, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to go explore by myself. And so I went down. And to be honest with you, I saw the plaques, and I saw it said something, the Aleppo Codex. I read that, and honestly, I'll be honest, I didn't really understand what the plaque was telling me. It was confusing. It wasn't so clear. I'd never heard of this thing before, and I just kind of like glanced over it quickly and hurried back so I didn't get lost. You don't want to be the teacher in training that gets lost. And I left, and like I said, I didn't really know. I was vaguely aware of it, and I kind of just put it out of my mind for a while. But as I said, it kind of came up more and more throughout my studies, and I wanted to look into it more, and I kind of became somewhat, I don't know, say obsessed, but really like interested in what exactly the Aleppo Codex was, and I was just kind of waiting for the right opportunity to study it. And once I did, as I said before, it really opened my eyes, and now I understand why it's in the shrine of the book, and I hope I can explain it to you as well. Now, in order to understand that, though, we have to understand what exactly this book was, the Aleppo Codex, and why it was so important. So, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Second Beit HaMikdash, by the Romans in 70 CE, and the failure just shortly after that of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, most Jews had either been exiled or fled the land of Israel. This was the start of what we call the Great Diaspora. It's the diaspora that we're basically still in today. And we see the dispersion of the Jewish people on a scale that we had never had before. And we have different Jews living in different lands, speaking different languages. And the biggest challenge to the Jewish people is going to be, how on earth are we going to remain united, right? How are we going to be one people? We've been one people our entire existence, and now we're all over the world. And the answer is, we all share the same book. Now, that's the Torah, right? And the Torah and the Tanakh in general. And this shared book is going to keep us together despite our physical and cultural distance. In order for this to work, though, there needed to be a consensus on how this book was read and written, right? And that sounds simple, but it's actually tricky, because the Torah didn't come with punctuation, and so there has to be a way to know how to punctuate, pronunciate, and even how to write the calligraphy of a Torah that is uniform across the entire world. I don't know if you guys have seen it, and I will pull it up in a second. The Torah is written also with all these like little crowns above each letter, and there's all kinds of mystical reasons for crowns, right? We have Torahs that our Torahs wear crowns on the outside, but our Torahs also wear crowns on the inside, right? It's Mati Friedman describes it as the Jews dress their Torah up like a king, and so where do we know where to put which crown? Some have 3, some have 2 spiked crowns. Like, where do we know as of how do we know how to pronounce this word and not that word? Now, our tradition tells us that all of these things were actually given to Moses on Mount Sinai, which is appropriate with Shavuot coming up this week. And it was passed down orally for generation to generation, and it's what's known as the Masorah. The problem was with the Great Diaspora, for the first time, we're facing the real possibility that this Masorah will be lost if it's not written down. And so there are going to be a number of scholars who sit down to write authoritative texts of the Tanakh so that we will have a book to use as the uniform for every community throughout the world. And the most, I would say the most famous and considered the most accurate and authoritative was written in the town of Tiberias, right, in Tiberia, on the coast of the Kinneret, which, by the way, I should say Jews that weren't exiled or fled the land of Israel after the Bar Kokhba revolt, many of them ended up congregating in Tiberia. It was also the last seat of the Sanhedrin, or council. And there, on the banks of the Kinneret, a rabbi named Rabbi Aaron ben Asher is going to sit down and write what we will eventually call the Aleppo Codex, but what came to be known as the Crown. Okay, the Crown, as I said, is considered to be the most authoritative of all of the copies of how the Tanakh should be read, written, and pronounced. It was distinct. This is a picture of one of its pages here on the left. It is distinct for having 28 lines per each column and 3 columns on every page, and in the margins are the notes of Rabbi Aaron ben Asher. As I said, this book was widely revered, mainly because of the respect people had for Rabbi Aaron ben Asher and his family. They were a pretty serious rabbinic dynasty. And because of that, the Crown came to be considered the book about the book, right? It was the book about how to read the Torah and how to write the Torah. And as far as Aaron ben Asher was alive, it remained with him. And then Aaron ben Asher is going to pass away. And the book is going to begin a journey. The Crown is going to begin a journey, maybe unseen by any other text in Jewish history. So the truth is that originally it doesn't travel all that far. The first place that it goes is that somehow after Aaron ben Asher's death, the Crown finds its way into the hands of somebody who sells it to the Karaite community in Jerusalem. Right, so this is my technological exploration, and I hope it works over Zoom. Right. See. All right. Looks good. Great.
We see a screen.
So the Crown has now made it to the old. What's that?
The screen is blank.
Oh, okay. So
there you go.
Okay. So the Crown makes its way to the Karaite synagogue in the old city of Jerusalem. Now, the Karaites, for those of you who don't know, was a sect of Judaism that rejected all rabbinic law and saw the Torah itself as the only supreme legal authority. And because of that, they were very much in conflict with rabbinic observing Jews. They didn't get along at all, and it would turn very, very ugly. And the Karaites were the next recipients of the Crown. There was actually, there's a theory that Rabbi Aaron ben Asher himself was a Karaite. But the Crown is going to sit in their synagogue in the old city. If any of you have ever been to Yeshivat HaKotel, it's actually my alma mater. The old Karaite synagogue is just outside the door. It's just above the 2 lions in the old city. If you've been there, near the Jewish quarter, the old city, the Rova Square. They're actually redoing it right now. They're renovating it, so it'll be interesting to see what it looks like after. But that's where the Karaite synagogue is, and that's where the Crown remained. What's astounding is to understand just how significant the Crown was to the Jewish people. The Karaites, who did not get along with the rabbinic Jews, despite that, on the Shalosh Regalim, on the 3 pilgrimage holidays, right, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, would take the Crown out. Those are the only time they would take it out of its cabinet, and they would put it on display for everyone, including rabbinic Jews, to see. Right, so the Crown transcended even sectarian disagreements, and that was a pretty big deal. And so the Crown remained in Jerusalem for some time. And then history is going to intervene yet again. In 1099, the Crusades come to Jerusalem, right? The Crusaders conquer Jerusalem. It is a pretty horrible fate for the Jews in Jerusalem. Savage murder and plundering. The old city is completely destroyed, and whatever Jews haven't been killed are held for ransom. And they don't just take people for ransom, they also take precious items for ransom as well. And that is going to include the Crown. The Christian Crusaders put a ransom on the Crown. And this presents a problem, because if you open up the Crown and you look at one of its first pages, it says specifically in the Crown, "This book shall never be ransomed. Do not ransom for the Crown." And that was obviously done on purpose to discourage people from stealing it in the first place. But in this case, it didn't work. And so because of that, also, this command was completely ignored. And so there's going to be a Jewish community that has already left the land of Israel. They're going to be in Fustat, which is Old Cairo in Egypt. And they're going to raise the appropriate money to ransom the Crown and bring it to Egypt. I don't know if this one. Okay, so we're just going to do that. Okay, Fustat. And so here it is in Egypt. Now, I don't know if it's just luck or providence or what, but it's pretty amazing that the crown is going to find itself here in this time period, because the crown is about to make a very famous friend. Okay. At the time, there was intense Muslim persecution of Jews in Spain. And many Jews were converting. We had the Spanish Inquisition, of course, and many Jews were converting. Some were converting for real, some were converting in fake. And there was one Jew, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who converted to Islam in, exterior, on the exterior, until he could escape. And eventually he is going to escape to Fustat in Egypt. Now, of course, we know him not as Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. We know him as the Rambam, or Maimonides, right? And he is going to find himself in Fustat in 1168, right? So just like 70 years after the crown gets there. 2 years later, in 1170, the Rambam is going to sit down and begin working on his magnum opus known as the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is an amazing series of books. It is the most detailed of books that you could imagine about observing Jewish law. I mean, it's so detailed that he writes a whole section on how to do work in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, at a time where there is no Beit HaMikdash. But he puts detail into the entire book. And one of the sections in the Mishnah Torah is the Rambam's rules for writing a Torah. And what's amazing is if you actually take a look at the text there in the Mishnah Torah, it's the halachas, the Jewish laws of writing a Sefer Torah, chapter 8, verse 4, or halacha 4, right, law 4, the Rambam actually says, for the rules of writing a Torah, the copy on which I relied is the well-known Egyptian Codex, which contains the 24 books of the scripture, and which has been in Jerusalem for several years, used as a standard text for the examination of scrolls. Everyone relied upon it because it had been examined by Ben Asher, who closely studied it for many years and examined it again whenever it was being copied. This codex was the text on which I relied in the scroll of law that I wrote according to the rules. So that means that in the Rambam's rules for writing a Torah, he is relying on the crown and mentions it in the Mishnah Torah itself, which means the rules that we have today for writing a Torah, and we get those from the Rambam, were from Ben Asher and the crown. And that's pretty amazing. So the crown remains, as it were, in the possession of the Rambam for the rest of the Rambam's life. When the Rambam dies, he bequeaths his entire library to his ancestors. And so his ancestors remained in Egypt for another 5 generations, until eventually political unrest in Egypt is going to make his great-great-great-grandson pack up and leave for Aleppo, Syria. And that is how the crown is going to arrive in Aleppo. It will remain in Aleppo for the next 600 years. Okay, it is eventually going to make its way to the synagogue in Aleppo that has all kinds of crazy theories about it. Right, Aleppo is believed to be the ancient biblical area of Aram Tzova that was conquered by King David himself, and it even talks about it, right? That Yoav, the King David's general, fought a war and he conquered Aram Tzova. And the tradition in Aleppo is that Yoav, King David's general, actually laid the foundation stone of the Jewish synagogue, the great synagogue in Aleppo. But whatever the case is, and however long that synagogue really was there, that is going to become the crown's new home. Right, this is the Great Synagogue of Aleppo in its day, and this is what it looks like, unfortunately, today, and we'll understand in a second why it looks like that. But there, in the synagogue, against the southern wall, was an area called Elijah's Cave. And in Elijah's Cave was a safe. That safe had 2 locks with 2 separate keys held by 2 different people. It really sounds like nuclear launch codes. And only those 2 people with those 2 keys could open the safe, which contained the crown. Now, they rarely did this. They rarely opened up the safe. And the crown began to take on mythical importance in Aleppo. Anybody who needed something would go before it, beseech God in front of it, ask God for things. If a woman wanted to, get married, she would go there. If someone was having trouble having kids, anything that you wanted to ask God for, they would go in front of the crown and they would pray. It also took on other myths like the belief that anybody who steals it will be cursed forever, and anybody who moved it then would be cursed forever. It was also believed that if the crown was removed from Aleppo, a horrible fate would befall the Jews of Aleppo, which is ironic because we'll soon see that it is actually the reverse order of what happens. And because of all of this, what ends up happening is that the Aleppo Jewish community is going to become incredibly overprotective over the crown. So there are going to be people who see it every once in a while and kind of become enamored with it. And one of those people is Yitzhak ben Tzvi, who's eventually going to become Israel's second president. You probably recognize him from the old 100 shekel notes. Doesn't matter what our 100 shekel notes look like anymore. Don't worry, if you still got these in your wallet, they're still good, they still work. But that's Yitzhak ben Tzvi. And before he was president, in the 30s, he was in Aleppo. And he managed to get a glimpse of the crown, and he became absolutely obsessed. And this is important because he's going to factor big into the rest of the story. But he becomes absolutely obsessed. And he doesn't just become obsessed with the crown. He becomes obsessed with the idea that the crown must be brought to the land of Israel. It can't stay in Aleppo. So this is in his head for, from now on, after he sees it in the 30s. And he can't really get it out of his head. In 1943, a group known as the Jerusalem Circle, headed by Yitzhak ben Tzvi, gathers to talk about what's going on in the world. They're really talking about what's going on in World War II. And ben Tzvi says, listen, I see the destruction that's happening in the world because of World War II, and I'm really worried. I think that we need to bring the crown to the land of Israel to protect it. Now, he knew that if this random Ashkenazi Western European guy shows up in Aleppo and starts asking for the crown, it's not going to happen. So they look in Hebrew and they find a young professor who actually was born in Aleppo. His name is Yitzhak Shamosh, and they decide to send him to ask the Aleppo Jews for the crown. I don't think they understood at this point what the crown meant to the Aleppo community. Shamosh, despite being an Aleppo Jew himself, made no progress whatsoever. He was rebuffed at every turn, at least when he talked to the elders and the people who were in charge of the crown. And so Shamosh was about to go home with his hands empty and to tell the Jerusalem Circle that he had failed. Now, just hours before he was to head to the train station, two young Aleppo Jews showed up at his place of where he was staying. And they said, listen, our elders can't see it. They're too attached to the book and they're too superstitious. They're not going to get rid of the crown, but we agree with you. The crown is in danger, and we want to, we know a way that we can probably sneak it out and get it to you. Meet us at the train station with an empty suitcase. Shamosh can't do it. Maybe it's because he was an Aleppo Jew, but for one reason or another, he decided that that's not the way that he wants to acquire the crown, and he returns back to Israel empty-handed. Yitzhak ben Tzvi is later going to say, quote, "Too bad we sent an honest man." And that's what happens. So ben Tzvi doesn't give up. He's still obsessed. And he wants desperately to get anything he can about the crown. And so he sends another crew asking if they could just photograph it. And they're rebuffed. And finally, after a lot of negotiating, they're able to secure a promise from the Aleppo Jewish community that one Hebrew University professor can come and look at the crown for 15 minutes. So that's not a lot of time, but ben Tzvi will take what he can get, and he decides to send the former chief rabbi of Florence, a professor at Hebrew, a guy named Rabbi Umberto Cassuto. Rabbi Cassuto at the time was actually writing his commentaries on the Tanakh, and he wanted very much to see the crown and see what was in it and how it was written. And he is going to get to travel to Aleppo. He is actually given the runaround for 2 or 3 days before they actually take him to the synagogue. They pull out the crown, and he is able to negotiate his way into 4 hours with the book. He's the only modern scholar ever allowed to sit down and see it, and he actually compared it to the Bible that we have today. And so a lot of the information we had in that time period came from the visit of Rabbi Cassuto. And it looked like that was the history of the crown. It was just going to be this thing that, you know, every once in a while someone would be allowed to see because of the Aleppo community, and it would just remain there. But again, history is going to intervene. On November 29th, 1947, a fateful day here in the land of Israel, the United Nations voted in favor of UN Resolution 181, the partition plan for Palestine, which essentially greenlighted the creation of a Jewish state in the land. While this was really, really great news for the Jews living in the land of Israel and other places outside of the land of Israel, this was really bad news for Jews living in Arab lands. Anti-Jewish pogroms broke out throughout the Arab world following the UN vote, and Aleppo was not spared. The 1947 Aleppo anti-Jewish riots decimated this 2,000-year-old community. The synagogue, obviously itself completely destroyed, everything inside ransacked, save for the Torah scrolls pulled out, the books pulled out, set on fire, and at least believed at the time, the safe in Elijah's cave was pried open, its contents dumped onto the floor. And what many people believed was that the crown itself was consumed in the fire of the synagogue. There were some rumors out there that maybe the crown had survived, but most people didn't believe it. In fact, Cassuto himself wrote an obituary for the crown in Haaretz once the news broke that the synagogue had gone up in flames. While it's not entirely clear how the crown was survived, and all the people who've studied this seem to have disagreements, and there are multiple people in the Aleppo Jewish community who claim to have been the ones who rescued the crown, or at least parts of the crown. What we do know is that it somehow managed to find its way into the hands of a Jewish textile merchant in Aleppo, and he was going to hide it in his shop for the next 10 years. But from the pogrom onward, the Aleppo Jewish community is dwindling. In 1947, there were more than 10,000 Jews in Aleppo. By the mid-1950s, there's less than 2,000, right? The vast majority of them had gone to Brooklyn at this point, right? That's where most Syrian Jews are today. And a minority went to Israel as well. For those who stayed, their freedoms were severely restricted and were facing serious backlash due to state-sponsored propaganda against them. And so by the fall of 1957, the rabbis of Aleppo finally see the writing on the wall and decide they're going to do the unthinkable. They are going to move the crown for the first time in 600 years and send it outside of Aleppo. So there was a Jewish cheese merchant in Aleppo at the time named Muad Farham, who had just obtained a fake Iranian passport in hopes of escaping to the land of Israel. So the rabbis of Aleppo approach him and say, we need you to go pick up the crown from this textile merchant and bring it to the land of Israel. Now, who he was supposed to give it to when he got there is a whole other question, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Farham retrieves the crown. He wraps it in cheesecloth. He hides it inside his washing machine. He puts like some onions and some nuts on top of it inside, and he puts it, he puts it on the family truck, and he heads towards the border with Turkey. That's how Jews were getting out in those days. He is going to head, after some scary moments at the border, eventually get through and make his way all the way to the coast of Turkey, to Alexandria. And it is there where there are some Jewish Aliyah department agents helping Jews actually not sneak, but helping Jews sneak out, of Turkey and into the land of Israel. And this is where things get even dicier, because we don't really know how or why, but the Jewish agencies seemed to know, even before Farham got there, that he had the crown and that they knew exactly where he was when he arrived in Alexandria. And what happens is, all of a sudden they realize, Farham realizes that he's being treated way better than the other Jews in Alexandria waiting to make Aliyah. He had a conversation with a number of Aliyah department agents. And again, what was said in that conversation is up for debate. All we know is that 3 weeks later, on December 16th, 1957, the crown has been returned to the land of Israel. and it is quickly given in to the government of Israel. They quickly turn it over to the Ben Tzvi Institute, where it is Yitzhak Ben Tzvi has created his own institute at this point, and now they are in charge of the crown. Now that becomes incredibly controversial because there are a lot of Jews from Aleppo who moved to the land of Israel who believe that the crown belongs to them. There were the two former chief rabbis of Aleppo were now living in Jerusalem, and they wanted the crown. They assumed that if the rabbis back in Aleppo had sent Farham with the crown, it was to be given over to them. And so they're actually going to hire some lawyers, and they're going to sue the state of Israel for the right to control the crown. This lawsuit was actually kept secret for over 40 years and only recently discovered and exposed. In it, the Jews of Aleppo living in Israel accused Farhan of betraying the Aleppo rabbis in exchange for better immigrant conditions for his family when they arrived in Israel. When he gave testimony, gave a confusing testimony over who exactly he was meant to give the crown to once he got there. But the trial drags on for 4 long years, and it eventually ends with a settlement. The settlement is that Farham admits that he was meant to give the crown to the Aleppo rabbis, but he didn't. Therefore, the agreement is the Aleppo community will be given part ownership of the crown, but it's not to be moved from the Ben Tzvi Institute. And so effectively the crown stays within the control of the government. In addition to all this other drama, when they take a look at the crown, something shocking is apparent. It's missing a ton of pages. It's the Tanakh, but the 5 books of Moses are missing except for the last chapter of Devarim, the last book. Parts of the end are missing as well. What happened to those missing pages is also up for debate. Were they lost in the fire? Were they lost during the riots of another time? Did some Jews of Aleppo rescue these random pages from the synagogue and keep them for themselves? Did Farham steal them and take them for himself or sell them? For years, Jewish antiquity dealers searched for the lost pages of the crown. And this is a whole nother section of the story that deserves its own class and crazy intrigue. There actually was, in the late 80s, a ultra-Orthodox black market antiquities dealer named Chaim Schneelball, and he was rumored to have been selling parts of the crown that had, that were not in the crown itself, right? Like random pieces that he had come into possession. And on August 16th, 1989, he arranged to meet a potential buyer at the Plaza Hotel in Jerusalem. The next morning, he was found in a hotel room in the Plaza, dead. And the police file on that is still classified. So make whatever you want of that, that you will. The crown is going to sit in a filing cabinet in the Ben Tzvi Institute until the 90s, where they are convinced to finally transfer it over to the Israel Museum in the Shrine of the Book. Parts of it are on display in the Israel Museum just below the Isaiah scroll, as I said at the beginning, although I should say that there are people that claim that even what's in the display case is not the real crown at all. And so it's clearly a book that has inspired some controversy. And here it is. The vast majority, even if some of it is real, the vast majority of it is somewhere in the bowels of the Israel Museum in some temperature-controlled safe. And so, if you were hoping for a satisfying resolution to this whole story, I'm not sure you're going to get one because the mystery of the crown continues until today. Now, I started off by telling you that I think that there's another reason why this story is important. Now, one reason is everything I just went through. It's an amazing story, and it's an important book, and it seems to touch on some of the most amazing historical events and people of Jewish history. The Rambam and the Crusades. It spent time in Jerusalem. All these things that I'll get to again in a second. But I think that there's one more reason why the crown is so important. And I just want to tell you, one of the first times I heard about the crown, I jotted down some things about the crown, like kind of like freehand, and just looked at it and kind of thought about what it said to me. And so I just want to share this with you. When I think about the history of the crown, it's the most widely accepted perfect copy of the Torah. It was born in the land of Israel, spent significant time in the Jewish people's eternal capital, Jerusalem, but it then faced exile, pogroms, violence, and eventually redemption. But even redemption came with hardships and complications. Infighting, greed. It's clear that the redemption is incomplete. And now it's on display, telling its story to the world as it continues to struggle to be seen and heard among its louder and more prominent neighbors. What does that sound like to you? Because to me, that sounds like the Jewish people. We're often referred to as the people of the book. And it's true. I mean, if you take a look at the bottom left here, this is a picture from Siyum Hashas, the finishing of a 7.5-year cycle of learning Talmud, and they pack sports stadiums for reading a bunch of books. What other people would do that? We're certainly the people of the book. And if we're the people of the book, then I think the crown is the people of the book's book. It's not just that it traveled through Jewish history. It's that it is Jewish history. And so the reason why I really wanted to share this with you today is that I hope that, obviously, the next time you can make it to Israel and to Jerusalem and into the shrine of the book, I strongly encourage you to take the stairs down and discover what's on display there. But just, even if you never make it there again, just to remember that this book, in addition to just being a book, is also kind of a reminder every day of our history and what we've gone through and what we still have yet to achieve. Right, this incomplete redemption that we are trying to complete and find some kind of redemption and wholeness as a people. And I think the crown will always serve as a reminder of that for me, and I hope for you as well.
Donnie, thank you. Your technology worked. You see lots of people, including myself, are applauding. It was awesome as a avid historian. That was just really, really cool.
Thank you.
I'm curious, who was the teacher that trained you?
Danny Stein.
It was Danny Stein. Right. So, thank you so much. We'll open it up to questions. I'm going to judiciously unmute everybody. We've got a few new faces with us today, participants. So give me 1 second. And if there are any questions, we can allow for questions. Give me 1 second. You all should now be able to unmute yourself. So if you have a question for Donnie, please feel free to unmute yourself, just recognizing there may be background noise, and we're happy to have you ask a question.
Did too good a job, I guess.
I have a question. Hi. Have any of the missing pieces showed up over the years?
So, yes.
Or that are legit?
Both. There have been some that have been authenticated. And anytime that they have been, there's going to be a struggle over ownership. And if you want, there's actually an amazing book that gives more detail of this part of the story called, I have it right here if you want to see it, sure. The Aleppo Codex by Mati Friedman. So he talks about a lot of the fact that, yes, it was, there are ones that show up, but most of the time, the ones that have shown up have been proven to be false. So it's hard to know for sure. I know that here and there, but the vast majority are still missing. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
Who has the movie rights to the saga, The Crown?
If you're smart, you bought them while I was talking. Yes, you have a point. And if you know anyone looking for help on the screenplay, I'm available. Right, Greg? I'm not busy.
No, not at all. Well, Donnie, as always, thank you for just a wonderful class. And so much, just thank you. Before we conclude, I want to remind everybody to send me an email at glitkovsky@mhsi.org. We've got lots of new faces today, so thank you for joining us and our familiar faces. And before we go, Donnie, the classroom is yours.
I just wanted to wish everyone an amazing Shavuot. We guys all have a great experience, even in our new reality, and stay healthy. And we hope to see you back in Israel soon.